First of all, I also want to offer my thanks to so many people here, actually, because much of the research that I've been doing the last 3 years, which has partly been in Kenya, which is a country I'm just so thrilled I've come to know a bit, as well as in Nigeria and Mali and Ghana and North Africa. But especially in Kenya, I think Alex, we met in this office about 3-4 years ago, and I said, well, I was here with a colleague, we're doing some work on how music and art becomes a tool of resistance for young people against various forms of oppressive state power. He's like, wow, so are we. And here's 5 projects in Mombasa and Turkana, and I just basically took every number he gave me, and that became my project. So none of this would exist without the work that the East African Institute's been doing, and the vision they've had to really think about engaging in societal transformation, focusing on both youth and on art. And I think for me, as someone who comes out originally of Islamic studies, bringing youth and art and Islam together is an exceptionally rich combination, especially because all 3 are such problematic and overloaded and overdetermined concepts and terms that have been used in so many bad ways, that if you can bring them together and do something fresh with them, you can really do something interesting. So I want to just thank you, Alex, and also, of course, Leif Stenberg, who not only was my colleague at Lund University for almost a decade, but also when he moved over to greener pastures in London, and now here has been very supportive, and to everyone else, Charlotte and Soraya and everyone making this possible. So when I showed up here in Nairobi, I actually had come directly from Lagos. And Lagos and Nairobi, although they're in some ways sister cities, could not be more different, as anyone who's been to both knows. And part of the ways I think they're very different is the way music plays, the role played by music in the larger contemporary society, especially because the music industry here is not nearly as powerful and all pervasive as it is in Nigeria. And of course, the Lagos sound, for better or perhaps for worse, has become a dominant aesthetic paradigm across sub-Saharan Africa, including in Kenya. And what was happening 3 years ago when I first started meeting all these amazing local artists like Eric Wanena and Giuliani and so many of the other artists any of you who are from here or work here know, was understanding just how much they were trying to get out from under the weight of the Niger sound. But one of the things they didn't want to get out from was this history of music playing a very powerful role in Nigeria as a form of resistance. Of course, anyone who knows anything about popular African music knows Fela Kuti, and despite all the problems and everything he suffered, for being really one of the most important pioneers of political arts in Africa, his vision of music playing a powerful role in organizing young people and giving them an alternative vision of the present and the future, and also the tools to then transform that into politics, is something that I think all the artists I've met here who also see themselves as political have seen as their example to follow. So there's this very strange relationship with Nigeria, and that people are tired of being ruled over by it musically, but also it's still perhaps the main source of inspiration. And for what Fela did, and also for, I think, some of the political artists here that I've met, and while there are some people like the ones I've just mentioned who are fairly well known, Giuliani has, 300,000 Twitter followers. It's like 100 times more than I do. I don't know how anyone has that many. Or Eric Wanena, these people get millions of views. They're really popular. There's also people literally recording in huts up in Turkana. The most amazing music that no one will ever hear. Right? Yet that music is a powerful way for them to organize themselves. And it's not in isolation from other parts of their identities. It's actually at the core of their identity formation. And I think that complexity is something, I think, the way we're having these discussions today is something we need to take a lot of cognizance of as we move towards going from these kinds of presentations to putting together perhaps a book, as some people have suggested, or encouraging future research. I should say at this point in my research, I am at that wonderful point, or my fieldwork, where I think I know what I don't know, but I definitely don't know what I should know. Yeah. So like Mara, I'm going to be sort of talking about what I think is happening, what I think I should pursue, and hoping all the people here who know so much more than me will teach me enough to take a few more steps in the coming period. But even before that, I think it's important to think about the categories that have determined our discussions, because if we're going to bring together concepts like governance, Islam, even the idea of an East Africa, right, or Muslims, or the state, right, each of these we could do a conference on, right? Each of these is incredibly powerful, but also highly problematic. And I think they all warrant significant critique in the Kantian sense, not just to denigrate it or to say there's something wrong with it, but to try to understand what are the origins of these terms, how do they actually apply to this local situation, do they clarify or do they confuse the situation when we apply them to any specific research we're doing, and how can we develop these terms to be more useful to us, especially when we combine them. So I just want to start off by going through some of these and talk about how I've tried to understand them through my research, and hopefully learn some more from those of you who've done a lot more research here. The first, obviously, to me, I think is youth. Youth is such a crucial category. After Alex's talk yesterday, while you were giving your talk, I was thinking about this youth. You know, this is a strange category. And Gianluca reminded me later, well, youth isn't a new category, as I may have said just in my haste to talk about it. It's actually a quite old category. You can talk about it in Roman times as an Islamic category of the minor. And so it's not new, but there is something new about how youth as a problem, or youth as a concept, as a discourse, as a way of governing certain kinds of people has been deployed by states, right, in the last 150, 200 years. It emerges with the rise of industrial capitalism, with the excess populations that emerged as cities became centers of production. Youth have long been a problem that had to be dealt with. If you look at the way people were talking about New York City in the late 1800s, or London, young people were causing the same problems then as they are in Nairobi, in Kibera, in Lagos, or anywhere else. There have been area boys, as we describe them in Lagos, as long as there have been modern cities. So what does that mean, especially now that we're not in an era, especially here, of industrial capitalism anymore? If the nature of capitalism has changed towards a neoliberal model, how does that change the way we need to understand what youth is? And especially, how does youth link to other generations? I think some of the discussion we've had here about Subkem and the reading I've done on it, that's a very crucial issue, because you have a very powerful cultural organization or Muslim organization that has a generational problem, so to speak, right? Where it's led by older people, of course, men, very much tied to systems of governance and to government and governmental power. And then you have younger people trying to develop and push their own agenda and get more power, and they're usually rebuffed. And this leads to all kinds of tensions. So the way to talk about youth without linking it immediately to all kinds of systems of governmentality, I think is something we need to avoid. As Professor Naji said yesterday, we live in a society, or we live in societies that are very fluid. The institutions are very fluid, right? So when we're talking about these categories like Islam or youth, to me, it's almost like trying to catch lightning in a bottle, right? You can't really define it in any way that has enough solidity to be that useful. And if you do, you're automatically you're going to miss so much that the category becomes problematic in that sense. So we have two issues then. We have Islam and we have youth, right? In Kenya, both of them are growing, literally, right? The number of Muslims is growing and the number of young people are growing. So how do we deal with them still in a country where while youth are the majority, Islam is still very much a minority religion. There are actually more Muslims in France, for example, than there are in Kenya, and the percentage is not that much greater in Kenya than in France. So what happens if, instead of just comparing it to other African countries, we think about the problem of governing Muslims, comparing France, let's say, and a country like Ghana, for example, which has a similar, only I think maybe a slightly larger percentage of Muslims than Kenya, right? So reaching out to me, and especially because I work in Ghana and also in France, trying to understand how people experience themselves as Muslims and how the majority population experiences them as Muslims is very felicitous to look at these kinds of comparisons. The next issue, of course, to me, relates to governance, and several of our colleagues, of course, have mentioned Foucault's very important work in this regard. And we have this idea of Islam as being something that involves a kind of category that inherently involves governance. But if we think about governance in terms of governmentality, right, we have a very different idea, right? We have to think of all kinds of relationships and all kinds of ways Muslims govern themselves. How does a Muslim define himself or herself as a Muslim while also be governed by a state that may look at her or him hostilely precisely as they define themselves as a Muslim, and yet within their own community, defining yourself as a Muslim can be highly problematic, right? Depends on what kind of Muslim, who you're following, which tradition. So Islam as an identity and youth as an identity are both highly productive yet highly problematic. And I'm still not sure, after looking at this for 20 years, quite how to put them together. But I know this is something that a lot more research still needs to be done. Thinking about governance obviously leads to the idea of the state. And the state is one of the most problematic terms, but also one of the richest terms. One of my mentors in graduate school, Timothy Mitchell, wrote what I think is perhaps the most important article on the state of the last half century, perhaps, called The Limits of the State, which appeared, I think, in the American Political Science Review in 1990 or 1991. And there he talked about the state not as a set of institutions, organizations, not as a location of power, somewhere you can go, or different organizations or alliances, but as an effect of sets of practices and discourses that come together in certain ways, in certain times, and in certain kinds of spatialities. So if we think about the state, not as an organization that you engage or engages you, or disciplines you, or governs you, or punishes you, or kills you, or kidnaps you, or tortures you, but as the effect of a whole system, a whole bunch of systems of power and knowledge and truth regimes that come together, how does that affect the way we're going to study the way youth interact with the state, or the way Muslims interact with the state? I thought Professor Hirsch's discussion yesterday, it just struck me when she was talking about how well the Qadi courts function in comparison to the regular official state courts, and yet they're somehow thought of as different, is a great example of how, well, where are we drawing the boundaries of the state, right? What is that? Are they really outside the official? Are they really that different from the state, the normal state or secular courts? Or are they part of a larger system, relations of power and modes of governmentality, and therefore they play precisely the role they're intended to. They're not something that shows up the inefficiency of the other systems of power. That's exactly how the system in many ways might be designed to function, especially in a neoliberal system, which Kenya is more and more becoming. This also, to me, leads to the idea of corruption, which is very crucial for all of us who work in America, who work in Africa. It's hard to tell who's more corrupt these days, especially if they're coming from the US. I have a feeling the US would not score well if we tried to measure out corruption between the US and Kenya or Nigeria, for example. But the idea of corruption as being an anomaly, like there's something called the state or governance that ideally there's an ideal type of governance that doesn't involve corruption, is in fact not true, right? If we go to the work of Charles Tilly, right, I think he said it best, war making, the state is basically organized crime, right? That's what states have always been. It's a protection racket from the very beginnings of stateness. The idea is certain people who, for whatever reason, are able to arrogate the right and ability, and hegemonically or through domination, the right or the ability to use violence. And in return for taking part of your money, as much as that you can tolerate or will bear, they will protect you from other people who will otherwise steal you blind, right? And that is the state in his wonderful, wonderful article, State Making and War Making as Organized Crime, came out, I don't know, 20, 30 years ago. Still, I think, one of the defining ideas. So what does this mean if instead of talking about corruption as a problem, if we think about corruption as inherent in the practice of governmentality that then leads to the idea or the effect of a state, which we then think we're negotiating or having to dialogue with, but in fact is the product of the very processes we're looking at, not the premise of it, right? How are we going to study it in that case, if that's the way look at it? I was thinking of, what is it, Professor Wong's book, you were mentioned yesterday on It's Our Turn to Eat, right? Well, of course it's their turn to eat, especially in a neoliberal order, right? Corruption is not an after effect. Corruption is the very premise of neoliberalism, what we think of as corruption, right? If you have a state whose whole premise is that it shouldn't take care of you anymore, right? And its only job is to act as the night watchman or the day watchman, to have the stick to beat up anyone who gets out of line and to protect the wealthy, very much a class system, class dynamic, but certainly true. If that's more or less what the state does, it's happening now in America. We see the biggest thing the government does is, ICE raids on immigrants. That it does well. Provide healthcare, not so well. Right? This is not surprising to anyone coming from this part of the world, right? So if neoliberalism works in this way in terms of governance, then of course, handing someone cash to actually take care of you directly not only makes sense, it's better than nothing, right? Because the alternative is not more efficient government. The alternative is no access to any state power at all, right? So I think we need to think about corruption very much as not something we can get rid of, but as inherent to the practice of state power and the way state power functions. And again, if we go backwards a bit, that means how governmentality works. That means how technologies of the self work, how those who have power are able to discipline and train the rest of society to act in certain ways so that they keep the system running without those who do have all the power having to constantly intervene and hit them over the head, right? Now, as anyone who's worked in the music business knows, corruption, power, money, all of this is inherent to music as an industry. So artists deal with this all the time. And one of the most interesting things for me is that this is one of the good things about neoliberal globalization, in fact, is that the technologies associated with it, in contrast to so many other areas of life in contemporary society, have actually offered artists unprecedented freedom to develop their art and to get it out there, right? If anyone is a fan of the Frankfurt School, as I am, has read the famous debates between Adorno and Benjamin, the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction, and then Adorno's famous response to his friend in the culture industry. We know that as the age of industrial commodified artistic production developed a century or so ago, right, big corporations were able to capture artistic production and to commodify it and to control, at least at the larger societal level, how music and film and TV and other kinds of artistic production function. And because of that, the liberatory potential of art that could be reproduced and distributed in such huge volumes was lost. It was commodified, it was co-opted, it was defanged, it lost its liberatory potential. Even if it looked like it was liberatory, that was the great trick. In fact, it was just sucking you in even more. But there was something very unique that happened in the past 30, 40 years with the rise of digital technologies. With the age of digital reproduction, suddenly, and again, I'm thinking about not just when I'm in Dandora, at this wonderful little community center called Dandora Hip Hop City, or up in Turkana, where they're making hip hop albums in a hut. I don't know how all that equipment survived the dust, but it did, and they're producing really interesting stuff, right? When you think about that, right, with this age of digital production, anyone now, for a few $100s, can create a studio or a film or make a film right on their iPhone. But I'll just stick to music because that's what I do. They can not only imagine something, they can create it, they can upload it to YouTube or wherever, Bandcamp or SoundCloud or whatever. They can distribute it endlessly to the entire world without even trying. And most important, it's free, right? And because it's free, it's much harder to co-opt. So what happens if in the age of mechanical reproduction, art in many ways lost much of its liberatory potential if that potential challenged the dominant order? Maybe it could be a force for sexual liberation or other kinds of personal liberation that didn't challenge the dominant system. But certainly, if it did, it could be much more easily repressed. So this is a huge development. And despite the ability of governments who have now gotten the hang of the internet to repress people much and to shut off many aspects of the internet or to monitor Facebook, as so many governments are able to do now, still the ability to create and circulate art freely that can be highly critical is unprecedented, right? That also is, of course, not just music that can do that. If we look at Daesh or any organizations that have spread messages of hate, the radical right in the U.S. or in Europe, they also use these technologies in the same way. So there's a kind of competition, but I think as artists, it gives a potential that is really unprecedented. I want to talk about this in the context of the term that we mentioned a lot in the last 2 days, which is marginalization. And this is something here that I don't understand because I don't understand the political economy of Kenya particularly well enough to make a judgment. But I think it's important to have this discussion, which is the marginalization of both youth and the Muslim community, to the extent it is marginalized, in some ways it's not, in some ways it is. I do think it is very much class is an issue we need to bring into this much more than has been. But is this marginalization an effect of other processes, sort of collateral damage to a system, or is it inherent and necessary to the system? In other words, are these kids who are at such risk, whether they are in the slums of Rio, or of Kibera or Dandora, or in Mombasa, or up in Turkana, to just keep it in Kenya, are these kids on the margins, are they just merely disposable? Do they literally have no role other than being disposable? Right, if we think of Agamben and his idea, I mean, it wasn't his idea, but his discussion of Homo Sacer, right, of entire groups of people who can now be placed in the state of exception, who can be completely outside of society, but be useful to society insofar as they are disposable, right? The violence against them is in fact vital to the functioning of the system, right? If depending on how we understand that, and again, I have no idea what the answer is in Kenya today. I may understand a little bit in, let's say, the Niger Delta, where I've done more work, but certainly in Kenya, I don't know at all. But I do know that the answer is crucial to understanding, well then, what does an identity like Islam mean? How is it performed by young people in the context of living on the margins as disposable, not even individuals anymore, just disposable people? A friend of mine, a well-known rapper, Giuliani, some of you may know him, was telling me, who has this space, Dandora Hip Hop City in Dandora, was saying on election night, and no one said hardly anyone reported this, he was getting calls all the time of people who were just disappearing. And it wasn't that they were killed, and that they just disappeared. And they would just be killed, dumped in a bag, and no one will ever see the body again. They're just literally removed from the earth. and no one can do anything, and no one, in other words, no one who matters and no one in the national media cares, or at least will say anything. So these people literally, their only function was to disappear. That's their value. Their value lies in disappearing, and in that disappearance, they reinforce the existing political order. And of course, some of them were Muslim, right? Some of them weren't. But it happens to other people specifically because they are Muslim, or others because they are activists still here. So what I'm trying to understand is, well, is this a necessary part of the functioning of the system? Or is this just a glitch in the system that can actually be healed, right? It's kind of like The Matrix, I guess, in a way, like the movie The Matrix, when you think about it. Is this just a glitch that's inherent, or can you fix it? And when I think about organizations like Supken, for example, and the way they dialogue with the government, or other organizations, I wonder, if you're trying to dialogue with the government to get better services or get treated better with dignity, the very premise of discussing this with the government as leaders of a community is somehow that, well, if they want to, they could actually treat you better. That the system can function as it is with a radical change in the way you are treated. The same way African Americans in America assumed if they were just given civil rights, somehow the system, the kind of system that exists in America, a particular kind of capitalist system, could function with them given their full human rights. Of course it couldn't. And in the end, in many ways, the discrimination became even more vicious. And as people got their civil and political rights, then the prison complex, the war on drugs took over, and people began, mass incarceration, which became, again, vital to the functioning of the system as it was changing and becoming liberalized. So I wonder how does this work here, and what role does Islam as a category, as a marker, as an identity that people use when they engage the government, what role does that play? Well, again, coming back to music, Michel Foucault, aside from providing us such wonderful categories of analysis about governmentality and disciplinarity that most of us use all the time, had another wonderful category towards the end of his life called political spirituality. And this idea developed out of, first of all, which few people know, his work in Tunisia in the late 60s. He was actually in Tunisia teaching when the student revolt of 1966 through 68 happened. And it so impressed him that when May 68 happened in France, he was extremely dismissive of it. He thought they were a bunch of bourgeois kids who were actually risking nothing other than a little tear gas, whereas his students in Tunisia were risking their lives, they were risking torture, they were risking decades in jail to really fight. So it gave him an idea of what really revolt means if it's real. And that transferred the next time he spent significant amount of time in a Muslim country, which was in Iran, during the initial phase of its revolution, for which he was heavily criticized, but I think wrongly, but that's a different discussion. But what's important to me is that he came up with this idea of political spirituality to talk about how the revolt he was witnessing in its early phases in Iran was radically different from other revolutions and other kinds of protests. And what he said is that these protesters had a kind of religious eschatology. They had a kind of a set of practices that helped loosen the power of regimes of truth. Loosen the power, that's an important word. That tell us who we are, right? And which establish the divisions between us. So a political spirituality, he said, will create a new horizon, a true religious spirit, a true political spirituality, unlike a socialist spirituality, right? Or unlike a non-religious kind of politics, has the ability to create horizons that are much further than the ones we normally operate on. And because of that, they are actually truly revolutionary because they give us a glimpse of what's outside of the possible in the system we're currently living. Right? How can you truly revolt if you can't somehow see beyond the contours of the system? Right? Just to think of the Matrix again, you can't leave the Matrix until you actually suddenly realize you're in the Matrix, because you can see there's something outside. So in that very sense, And the other thing that he pointed out is that the Iranian Revolution was the first great revolt against neoliberalism. Right? So he said it was revolt of bare hands. So again, I think that's this idea of political spirituality. Well, we know religion is spiritual, but of course music is spiritual, right? And music and religion, especially in Islamic countries, often clash because they're doing the same thing. They're appealing to certain elements of people's needs and drives and desires in ways that compete with each other. So many musicians, whether I'm in Pakistan or here or in Nigeria, have said, you know, the mullahs hate us because we're their competition. But what happens if they work together? And that's one of the most interesting things I've seen here is that whether it's in Dandora, the little bit I've been to Mombasa, and I haven't been there enough to really make any definitive conclusions, but certainly up in Turkana as well, you see activists working intercommunally. You see them creating art that is absolutely spiritual. Spiritual in the sense of Paul Tillich's idea of religion as ultimate concern, of this power that can truly transform your life and reshape the way you govern and care for yourself. Right? So music as a form of political, spirituality, and religion as a form of cultural performance, when they intersect, that becomes very powerful. And I'll just end with something that I found very interesting. And again, this is my preliminary research, and it could be completely wrong because it's based on too small a sample. But when I've talked to, let's say in Dandora, where there's a couple of mosques, or up in Turkana, where there's also an Islamic center, or in Mombasa, the few people when I met with some musicians there and also some of the communal organizations, what you get people acting, performing their Islam through the creation of this art, but they're not doing it as Islamic art. They're not creating Islamic music. But they're not foregrounding the religious part, but it is also completely inherent to their process of creation and to the politics that goes along with it. Right? So what I'm hoping to get to know, to understand, as I keep on my fieldwork, is how does this process actually work? And what does it mean for our understanding of what quote unquote Islam is? If people are performing their Muslim identity through the creation of music with non-Muslim, with Christians, with people, you know, their neighbors and their peers who are traditional religions, right? But together they are able to overcome the single biggest thing that governments love to do, especially in the neoliberal order, in order to maintain power, which is to create suspicion and technologies of rule that divide people and keep them from acting together and creating alternative networks of power, right? That at some point can actually challenge the quote unquote state power, right? So clearly music has a role, but it could also, I'll just end with this, be a very, I don't know how far it can go, because just for example, in Dandora, now that there is this space called Hip Hop City, it's a space now that it exists as a space, if the government gets pissed off at Giuliani, well, they know where to find him, right? And if they can't find him, it doesn't matter. They could just close the space tomorrow, or even worse, right? So as you reach a certain point, this liminal moment where you actually are popular enough to be an alternative space to government power, then the government suddenly, well, now we have you. And this is what happens. I've heard this all over, right? I've heard this in Morocco, in Egypt, in Tunisia, well, not in Tunisia anymore, thankfully, but certainly Morocco, Egypt, Iraq, Nigeria especially, and here, which is that once you want to eat too, right, then the government has you, because it can just say, you know, if you actually go that bit too far, your resources will dry up. You won't get gigs. You won't get downloads anymore. They won't allow you to have your music downloaded. If you push a little bit too hard, suddenly you'll be arrested, or worse, right? So this is the dynamic that artists are facing, not just here. It's a general problem artists are facing everywhere. On the one hand, neoliberal discourses have opened up all these spaces to resist in new ways, to engage in what some Muslim musicians say is a jihad, right? Their own version of jihad, but jihad resistance, normally resistance and Islam, they don't go well together when you say them in the same sentence, but for them it is resistance, but a good form of resistance. But again, once it reaches a level where the resistance doesn't just resist, but can transform, then the state, or those acting through discourses of state power, suddenly that's where they can catch you. So hopefully in the next few years I can figure out how is it that people are planning to try to escape this or work around it, or is that just the limit of what art can do against power? Thank you.